Try to cross us. I'll be running slash from here to Japan. No money, no comprende. A person look like Mexican. Moving yeah every day on your tracks, man. Important, extorting money, laundering. I'll be running slash from here to Japan. No money, no comprende. A person from the black Mexican. They don't really understand. Label me a contraband. Ever since the first days I put my hands in control substance. Hustling to advance when not to lack. Trying to earn me a platinum plaque. Smoking Vegas back to back. No endo. Carrying fully automatics attached to extendos. Never giving up info. Building on my credentials. Living in residential. Sacrificed by only the bare essentials. Running off at the dentos. They had you in ballistics in my section. Slip in and out without detection. But still got a question. Gospels off me 2 years in a new identity. Which protection? I told that neglected. The fact that I'm a victim of the ghetto. Where I'm from, we don't tell. We sell the shit with heavy metal. Put my foot to the pedal.
Strictly ghetto, nigga.
Send some little funky shit. Oh yeah, check it out.
And you step into this room of battle. And my friend, Sir Eric Thompson, whom I mentioned earlier about the Plain Jane Clubwoman thing, he said, it's a little raid. The Maya didn't have war, so this must be a little raid. But in fact, it is one of the great battle paintings in all of art history. You see this, it unfolds across 3 walls, and it includes figures who repeat from place to place, figures who straddle particular parts of going from one wall to another, figures where in one case a hand reaches out of a scene it doesn't belong in and touches another. This violation of the wall, the notion that painting is artifice. It's easy to look at these paintings and say, well, it's a documentary photograph. The Maya had war. We all get that now. But in fact, it's all about artifice. Part of the artifice here is time again that is unfolding. The battle starts at the far left. Trumpets blare. We come to this little vignette here in the center where this captive actually seems to fly right out of the scene. If you stand in that room, his feet feel in your face. And then captives along the bottom edge of the battle scene are trussed up. 2 or 3 victorious warriors, sometimes 4 or 5, all ganging up on individuals to strip them of their finery and tie them up and bring them to some other location. Watching it all up above are ancestor figures, ancestors and even the captives of ancestors, as though they live on in the stars. And if we go back to the color here, I will simply say that there's no azurite ground into the blue here, but rather carbon to make it dark and potent, perhaps dawn, perhaps dusk. If you sit on the bench, you sit on top of the captives. You're part of it. You're now a victor. You sit on someone whose fingernails perhaps have been pulled, his lips have been trimmed, his fingers pulled out of joint. This is where you are. You sit on them. And if you sit on them, you then look back at the door through which you walked. You walk through, turn around, and this is what you see. And it's often held up as the greatest of all the walls in the Bonaparte paintings.
Shout out to my folks over there at Yale, holding it down with this Mayan information in history, showing us that the Black Aborigines of America was already in America before Europeans came to America. As we look at the drawings and the paintings in the temples, the ancestors, dark brown, we know that the so-called Indians and Mexicans of today is not producing different shades, colors of brown people. It's not happening. It's only black people that's producing that dark chocolate, that red, that yellow. That's only black people that can do that. As you see, they saying that we're going back to 1000 BC and up to 1521. And that drawing painting, at the temple, they say it's from the 900s. Christopher Columbus and them didn't get over here till 1492. Now check this out. Now within the same book, The 8 Decades of Peter Martyr, we both read that the Spaniards found Negro slaves in this province. Now they talking about Balboa. Balboa is the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. It says that the Negroes, they live only in the region 1 day's march from Curica, and they are fierce and cruel. It is thought that the Negro pirates of Ethiopia established themselves after a wreck of their ships in these mountains. The natives of Curica carry on an incest war with these Negroes. Massacre or slavery is that alternate fortune of the two people.
Now, I know I ain't tripping because the paintings on the wall look just like what they talking about. Negroes and they getting down having wars. It's the same people. Check. Plus, I know that 8 decade story gotta be true because it's lining up with this book right here. Check this out. We already read it, but I'm supposed to bring it back. I'm bringing it back. Check. Also, Balboa declared that he went to discover the South Sea, and in a certain land named Curica, he found black people with frizzled hair where there never any other found either in New Spain, Castello or Peru. And this is 1513. Hey, they brought it up twice in the book. Check. He went therefore from Durn the first day of September, carrying some Indians of the country with him to be his guides, and he marched outward the land, sometimes quietly, sometimes in war. And in a certain place called Curica, he found Negroes captured with curled hair, and never up to that time were others seen or known until now, in all these parts of New Spain, Golden Castilla, and Peru. And then they made this movie in 1963, Balboa, Conquistador of the Pacific, and they slipped up and showed what the people looked like where Balboa had went in Panama. And they first slipped up with that totem pole. Then you see the statue back there. You see the drawing in the background. I mean, ain't no Mexicans or no Eskimos creating no kids that color. These is all black people, Aborigines of America. Now we going back to the 8 decades of Peter Martyr, where it say the vast region is divided into 2 parts, one called Taya and the other called Maya. And this is the first mention of the word Maya. The traders whom Columbus met were doubtless Mayas, coming from some of the great fairs or markets. For the second time, he brushed past the civilization of Yucatan and Mexico, leaving to later comers the glory of their discovery. And the story with that discovery involves this guide right here. Now check out the story where Cortez, who was the conquistador that conquered Mexico, check out this story on how he found his guide. And the man's name is Geronimo Aguilar. He was born in Spain. He came to the New World involved with the church and the missionaries. He went down to Panama when they first settled, and the people that was running it, I guess they was getting into it with each other. That was the person that got into it with Balboa, and Balboa wouldn't let him land, and they had to go back to Cuba. And on their way back to Cuba, they had a shipwreck in Yucatan, and he got stranded there for about 8 to 10 years. And when Cortez landed on the Yucatan, when we first started discovering Mexico, he heard some Indians within the area speaking Spanish. So they sent out a letter to those Indians to say, if y'all got a Spaniard over there, give him this letter and tell him to come meet us. And this is the story on when they met Aguilar. And this book right here, The Mastering of Mexico, is where we're going to get the game from. And 7 Indians came with Geronimo when he met the Spaniards. A soldiers in Tepeya's company promptly ran to Cortez with news that a Spaniard had returned. So much did his countenance look like that of an Indian that as the 7 men passed, many of our men kept asking, which is the Spaniard, and added to the fact that his complexion was naturally brown. He was shorn like an Indian slave. He carried a paddle across his shoulder and had a tattered stocking on one leg and another at his waist. And from right here, we know that the Yucatecans was brown like an African would be, because that's the only way that the Spaniard could be brown. All Spaniards are like a fur color, and the only time they was brown is when they had African descent, when they had Africans over there in Spain. So that's how we get in the mix up with the brown people over here in America and the brown people that's coming from Africa. And as you see, they easily could have got mislabeled because they was working with the black male slaves, Indians, and the giants. But we know that the Yucatecans are brown color, just like the Africans that came over with the Spaniards that's from Spain. Now this painting right here, the author is unknown, but it's depicting Cortez whenever he conquered Tabasco. Tabasco is Veracruz in the Yucatan area, and as you can see from the Indians in the painting, that it was already black people in America. Check this out. Now look at that black man over there to the right with the red feather on his head. Some more colored people. Also, look at the black man on the ground getting stumped by the horse. That's a black Aboriginal American right there. Now, we also have Juan Guaido, who they say is a black conquistador and who was the first African to be on North America's land in 1513 when he did an expedition with Leon in Florida. Now, once they took over Mexico, he was given many different titles as a doorkeeper, a courier, a constable, an auctioneer, an executioner, a piper, master of weights and measures, a doorkeeper, or guard. He settled in Mexico City in 1524 for 4 years and then began a gold mining operation with slave labor. He joined Cortez in the 1530s for still another expedition in search of the mythic Black Amazons. And you also got a military general, Vincent Palacio, saying that it's undisputable that in very ancient times the Negroes occupied Mexico. They brought their own religions, codes, and ideals. So now we're going to switch it up and we're going to take it to a description of what the people in the Carolinas was looking like in 1524 when Giovanni Verrazzano came through. He said that they go completely naked. They are dark in color, unlike the Ethiopians, with thick black hair, not very long, but tied behind the head like a small tail. They have a broad chest, strong arms, and the legs and other parts of the body is well composed. They have broad faces and angular faces. They also said they are not very strong, but they are sharp, cunning, and agile, swift runners. From what we can tell from observation in the last two respects, they resemble the Orientals, particularly those from the farthest Serene regions. We can also go to this book to get a description of the Indians in South Carolina. As it says, the Indians of South Carolina were reddish brown or copper color. The men were tall and straight with well-shaped limbs and almost perfect figure. Now, when South Carolina first jumped off with the British settlers, they was coming from the islands, Barbados, where they was running plantations down there, starting in 1620s. And around 1640, that's when the plantations and the businesses increased. And it looks like that they had expanded to the Carolinas in 1670. And this what was going on in Carolinas when they first got there. Now this book right here is where we get the real game of what happened in South Carolina. By the Spaniards, all settlements in Carolina were regarded as intrusions into Florida, but especially those south of Ashley River, for so the Council of the Indies read the meaning of the Treaty of Madrid. nor were officials like Governor Cabrera accustomed to discriminate nicely between the pirates and the colonists who sheltered them. And now the Spaniards were further wantonly provoked by the reckless Indian policy of the Scots. Yamasees were employed from Port Royal and incursions upon the mission's province of the Chickamaugas. There is evidence that they were incited by Lord Cardross himself and Trader Westbrook. Ample precedents might be found in the practices of the Charlestown traders, but in view of the exposed situation of Stewartstown, Woodward, who was not likely to be squeamish, was justified in condemning the Timacuas raid in 1685 as an unadvised project. The proprietors, too, for all their sympathy with Cardross, were convinced that this affair provoked the Spaniards' attack in the next year. Several Indians who took part in the destruction of Santa Catalina de Africa were examined on their return by Henry Woodward. They declared that the Scots had armed and excited them, and that they had burnt several towns, and in particular the said chapel and friar's house, and killed 50 of the Timacuas, and brought away 22 prisoners, which they delivered to the Scots as slaves. Now when I type in Santa Catalina de Africa, this is what pops up. Santa Catalina de Guale was a Spanish Franciscan mission and town in Spanish Florida, part of Spain's effort to convert the Native Americans to Catholicism. In the 17th century, this group of people had a dramatic population loss due to, they say, an epidemic disease. I don't believe that. They was just taking the people, slaving them. And after two major slave raiding attacks in the 1680s, the Santa Catalina de Guale missions was moved to South Sapalino Island. The attacking force consisted of about 300 Westo Indians who had been armed, supplied, and encouraged to attack the Spanish missions by English colonial authorities in South Carolina. Santa Catalina Guale was the first to fall. Its defense included a recently built fort, 6 Spanish soldiers, and about 40 Christian Indians. Other missions in the regions quickly fell to the slave raiders. By 1685, the Guale peoples had either fled inland, joining unconverted groups such as Yamasees, or had relocated to Amelia Island's 3 settlements of Santa Catalina de Guale, San Felipe, Santa Clara de Tupiqua. In 1702, during Queen Anne's War, the Carolina governor James Moore launched an invasion of Spanish Florida. In the process, the settlements of Amelia Island, including Santa Catalina de Guale, were destroyed. The surviving inhabitants, who remained under the Spanish mission system, moved to the vicinity of St. Augustine. Moore arrived in South Carolina from Barbados around 1675 and became the leading Indian trader and lieutenant of Maurice Matthews, a leader of the colony's leading political faction, the Goose Creek Men. After Goose Creek, an outlying area of Charleston, in 1683, Moore was granted 2,400 acres by the Lord Proprietors. He called his estates Butchewee. Part of this land is known today as Liberty Hall Plantation. James Moore and his wife had 10 children in the Lower Cape Fear region, where they and their descendants became known as the family, the most powerful family in the region. He led 500 colonists, 300 native allies, and 14 small ships on an invasion of Spanish Florida along the coast, destroying the remaining Spanish missionary Indians of Guala and Mocama, and devastating the lands around St. Augustine. Another result of the defeat of the Appalachians was the collapse of the final defense of the Indians of Florida. In the following years, Carolinians and Indian slave raiders virtually wiped out the Indian population of Florida all the way to the Florida Keys.
My big bro said last gon' step it up, finna buy some property, all these bitches jocking me. You niggas sleeping, I'm talking about big time, finna go to Izzy, yeah, I like the way shit shine.
Our speaker tonight is Theodora Light. She's a PhD student in history at the University of Georgia. Her research centers on indigenous Florida, particularly how Indian slavery affected Florida and the wider South during the 16th and 17th centuries. She currently works as a graduate teaching assistant, but has experience in training in the field of public history.
So it started really with this map. I came across it when I was doing research at the Archivo General de Indias, sort of looking for maps to correspond with some of the ideas that I was coming across that were just fleeting mentions, right? So when we study indigenous Florida or indigenous early colonial histories of any sort, we often have to go to sort of other sources of information in order to back up our ideas and our theories. So from the map that's in the map, probably came from a partnership between Hamilton and Colonel John Barnwell, otherwise known as Tuscarora Jack, right? So a lot of the indigenous information is coming from someone who is famous for his participation in the Tuscarora Wars. But it provides pretty incredible detail. And among that detail, as I was sort of focusing in on Florida, right, where I'm interested, I noticed here, and I can get a little pen here so I can laser point. I noticed this section here that I've circled for you. And the caption here is Tocobaga Indians destroyed 1709. And so a couple things came to my mind, and first and foremost among them is that that's not where the Tocobaga are from. Like, that's not their place. So was this like some mistake in the map? I had a lot of questions, right? What are they doing essentially in Appalachia, which is most of this region here? Like I said, and as y'all are probably familiar with, this is the area that's highlighted in the map. And these are the homelands of the Tocobaga. So what did I know about the Tocobaga? What have I learned about the Tocobaga? Around the time that Europeans invaded the peninsula of Florida, we have documentation of what they recorded life to be like, in addition to some archaeological work, though that has been spotty and not done very recently. So we sort of piece these things together from multiple sources. One of the primary targets of slave raids are these missions in North Florida. And so further than just this, what I've targeted for our talk as something that, sparked my interest. If you read closely, and again, the map on the Yale website is very, very clear. You can see, at least here, where it's identified Timucua, it says wholly laid waste, being destroyed by the Carolinians, 1706, right? And so these slave raids are impinging on a world that has been heavily missionized, decimated by disease for almost 150 years. And the sort of coup de grace is considered this series of raids perpetrated by James Moore, a Carolinian, with his Yamasee and Creek allies. And that is going to be the pretty much the end of the North Florida mission chains that had been populated by tens of thousands of people. And so when we ask this question, okay, what does it mean destroyed? What happened to them? The context here is that they've already been displaced from the area that they're from by an increasing regional instability, right? And they've relocated in groups as maroon communities in Appalachia. Appalachia, as well as Timucua and Guale, are already porous. These places have been subject to disease, conflict, a dozen rebellions, and increasing sort of clamping down on tribute requirements from the Spanish, from their capital at St. Augustine. You add in this slave raiding that starts at the end of the 1600s. This area is already so loose and horrific. It's bad things have been happening there for 150 years, right? And so by the time the Yamasee War happens between 1715 and 1717, and that's a whole nother talk in and of itself, all this conflict is just building and building and building. And central to the conflict itself is the pervasive nature of Indian slavery and its, sort of region-wide effects. As to the last question, what does destroyed mean? I don't think all Tocobagas were wiped off the face of the earth, right? That's the issue that we have with this sort of wholly laid waste or destroyed, right? It indicates that there's no cultural continuity, there's no survival. But of course, Florida is not only affected by the Caribbean, but powerfully impacted by colonization of Carolina and this sort of devastating Indian slave trade that develops there. Years, I don't remember when this book was published, but Alan Galley's Bancroft book, he posited that this slave trade enslaved between 30 and 50,000 people, indigenous people, who were either captured directly by the British or by Native Americans for sale to the British, often to pay off these sort of unruly debts that traders are imposing on them. And so this figure between 30 and 50,000, that's just before 1715 at the outbreak of the Yamasee War. And so, trading, even if it's slave trading, again, you're, spreading disease. Those communities are spreading disease. It's causing incredible conflict, is something that in a world where people do know what's happening nearby, it had to be terrifying, just the uncertainty of it all, the danger of it all. So this sort of uncertain, horrible world to live in might have encouraged people to say, you know what, we're going to go somewhere else, and maybe seek the protection of a powerful cacique, and attempt to leverage our economic viability or whatever, our kin ties going back hundreds of years, trade relationships, to live somewhere safer. I would suggest then that what they're doing, seeking protection from a world pervaded by notions of enslavement, changing notions of enslavement, that the term maroon works for this, for what's happening here. I would also suggest that indigenous marronage like this has existed in South Florida since those first reports at Calusa, in the first years of the 1500s, and that it likely existed across the peninsula and the wider Southeast. So why am I telling you all this, right? We're going to take this back to Appalachia and Tocobaga people living in Appalachia, because indeed they did live in Appalachia, and people have commented on this. So the map on the left is essentially, you can see up here is where it is in Florida. It's right at the crux of the curve of the panhandle. And this is Appalachia territory. And John Hahn, in his book on Appalachia, did identify several Tocobaga settlements. There's not just one. There are multiple sort of independent settlements of Tocobaga people. And where he's getting this information is from a 1678 visita by Domingo de la Turriondo. And that part of it is here on the right. And as he's crossing Florida, he comes across this, settlement of what he titles as Tocopacas infieles, or, literally infidel Tocobagas, who are living autonomously. They have a sort of economic role in the community itself. They're serving as river transport that the Spanish themselves use, right? So if we're talking about those economic ties that maroon communities are able to leverage, a perfect example. They are unconverted. They are not Christians, right? And the reason that this is important is by the second quarter of the 1600s, Appalachia is missionized. This is a Christian community. There's no discussion of how they ended up here. Why are they there? So there's just no 100% answer, but I think it would be plausible to suggest that the displacement of these groups, and they seem to correspond with what that sort of longhouse style of living that would have had groups of 100, 200 people who had, kin relationships, that they're just picking up and leaving Tocobaga and relocating as a larger kinship unit. And I would, suggest that the reason that they're doing this is because Florida is becoming increasingly unstable. Calusa has allied with the Spanish, at least temporarily, and the spread of disease and conflict and enslavement is something that, in a world where people do know what's happening nearby, it had to be terrifying, just the uncertainty of it all, the danger of it all. And then we've talked about who the Tocobaga are. Why is it weird that they're in Appalachia? What is their relationship to the other prominent indigenous kingdom in South Florida? And how do these themes relate to Florida being positioned in this sort of convergence of two, devastating shatter zones that are totally altering indigenous life in the Southeast? And my position that what it is doing is creating maroon communities that are solely indigenous, at least, maybe probably solely indigenous, across Florida and across the Southeast. So we don't know a ton about this group of people, but we do know a little from the memorial of Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, who as a child was shipwrecked on the Florida coast. And in 1575, he wrote this sort of description of Florida. And in this description, he talking about Calusa, he mentions that there are Cuban Indians who came in search of the Fountain of Youth. I don't think that's true. But the king at the time, Carlos's father, allowed them to settle within Calusa, and it appears that they lived somewhat autonomously, but under the control of the Calusa king, right? So to me, and I've posed this question here, as I was doing more research and digging deeper and deeper, the things that I was finding that might explain why Tocobaga people are not living at their home, they've moved to Appalachia and they're living in smaller groups. A theory that might explain this is marronage, right? Are these maroons? So what is marronage, right? I dug into the historiography. One interesting thing that I found is that, there are all these incredible books about maroon communities, but there's very little, there's not one definition of what is a maroon and what is a maroon community. There are several characteristics, right? So it's principally applied to these self-emancipated communities of African origin. However, they're often, if not always, relying on some degree of cooperation from indigenous people who are local to the area. Part of just knowing the terrain, which is usually in these hinterlands, or borderland areas where territorial control becomes a little blurred. They're relying on collaboration, but not just with Amerindians. They're also, to a degree, still part of the colonial system that is sort of characterized by slavery. Slavery doesn't exist without resistance to it. So, Richard Price, who is sort of the big figure in Maroon literature, said that successful Maroon communities worked out fairly extensive economic relations with colonial societies and harnessed a surprising amount of collusion by members of almost all social classes, right? So they're leveraging economic or political or military might in order to, get concessions. This is what we see most often across the Caribbean, probably most famously in Jamaica. They are going to be politically recognized and can be hired out, or their territory cannot be infringed.
And that's crazy that she say that, because when the Spaniards first settled in Jamaica in the early 1500s, they enslaved indigenous Tainos and brought other Amerindians into the island from other parts of their empire. Shortly after 1655, some say that the Spanish wiped out the native Indians, some say that they didn't wipe out the native Indians. But a small group of Amerindians found their way to what the Spaniards called the Blue Mountains, where they united with runaway slaves to fight the colonial authorities. In the 18th century, English soldiers was fighting groups of Africans and Indian ex-slaves of the Spaniards. This group, the Windward Maroons, were a mixture of Amerindians and runaway blacks. Maroons' oral history has consistently claimed Taino history, and there is some support for this theory in the writings of white Jamaicans. Archaeologists' evidence shows that the Maroons' claims of descent from the Tainos is correct, and that there was Tainos and African mixing in Windward Maroons communities. The Windward Maroons persistently claim descent from the first known inhabitants of Jamaica, the Tainos Amerindians, formerly classified as Arawaks. In their oral history, Maroons highlighted their descendants from Tainos to argue that they were the oldest continuous inhabitants of Jamaica, as opposed to the sons of slaves known as Abranos. Maroons claims that the black slaves who arrived in Jamaica after the Tainos were not entitled to the same privilege as the Maroons. Windward Maroons considered the Tainos to be the first Maroons and claimed descendants from them. And is that the same argument that the blacks in America is making, that the Africans that's coming over here ain't the same as us? Same thing. And then I asked AI, was Indians called Maroons in the West Indies? And this is what it says. No, Maroons in the West Indies did not refer to the indigenous people, but rather to escaped African slaves who formed their own communities away from the plantation system, often mixing with the indigenous population to some degree. Okay, they say Maroons were primary descendants of Africans who escaped slavery and established their own societies, often in remote areas. While not always the case, some Maroons communities did intermix with indigenous populations, leading to unique Creole cultures. Now, since we're talking about Maroons, it brings me to this book right here, Sir Francis Drake Revised, that was copywritten in 1695, where it has one of the earliest mentions of Cimarroons and its link to black people that was found in America and not brung to America. Now we can go to page 4, July 22nd, 1572, and Sir Francis Drake got some Negroes on board, and the Negroes on board informed them that the present state of the town, some soldiers were daily expected from the governor of Panama to defend it against Cimarroons, a black people who about 80 years past fled from the cruelty of their masters. Now let's get this together right now. They didn't have no masters like that. It's just that black people during that time was automatically listed as a slave. You was automatically an animal. You was automatically property unless they gave you a free pass. But off top, you was a slave. And this group grew into a nation of two kings of their own, one inhabiting westward and the other eastward. So this group, they been there for 80 years beefing. 1572 is going back to 1492, and I already showed you that the black people was found in the same area in 1513. They wasn't brought over here. And these are the people that they're calling the Cimarroons, the Maroons. Another fun fact is, as early as 1689, the colonial authorities of Spanish Florida had begun to offer asylum to escaped slaves fleeing from the Virginia colony, not the Carolina colony. One particular place of interest was St. Augustine, where the Spaniards had established Mission Nombre de Dos with the help of Afro-Spanish slaves
and settlers in the late 16th century. And what makes it so crazy about the Afro-Spanish slaves, Nombre de Dos is where they so-called say they found Negroes back in 1513 in Panama when they discovered the Pacific Ocean. Crazy how they got the same name.
So a lot of these characteristics that I'm reading about African maroon communities, they seem to really correlate with what might be these instances of indigenous people fleeing enslavement themselves. And so I am a historian, so I went to the documentary record. And sure enough, like, I knew that the term maroon itself came from a Spanish word, cimarron. And the first applications of the term cimarron in the Americas and the Caribbean is about Spanish livestock that are like running away and becoming wild. So as insulting as that is, the origin of the word, that is what it is. It is very quickly applied not to self-emancipating enslaved people of African origin, but to indigenous communities. So the Spanish fairly quickly, especially in the Caribbean, start trying to organize indigenous life in a separation between what they call Indios Bravos or Cimarrones and Indios Mansos, which essentially domesticated. And those domesticated, these Christianized, docile, indigenous people should have a level of autonomy and protection of the Spanish crown in these pueblos de indios that are literally Indian villages, right? European people cannot live in them. They are controlled by a local leader, though the Spanish crown can exercise some level of control as well. But the primary purpose in this documentary record is to separate these maroon Indians, the bad, dangerous ones, from the good Indians, right? And so just to give you an example, a lot of this is happening in the 1530s and 1540s, especially when Hernando de Soto is governor of Cuba. So there's a lot of records, accessible records for that period. And there's a whole series of sort of, these are documents from a series of justicia. So they're legal records to a degree. And, you see the application in this particular example that they're applying resources to combat the regiment of Maroon Indians, right? These bad, dangerous, unchristianized, heathen, and autonomous groups that are popping up in direct relation to abuses. So these documents are filled with acknowledgments by Spanish authorities that these people are running away because they are dying in droves and they're being worked to death. To me, that sounds very much like marronage. And indeed, that is literally the term that they use. So why am I telling you all this, right? We're going to take this back to Appalachia and Tocobaga people living in Appalachia. My understanding of what's going on in English Carolina and these devastating slave raids, you have a governor of Florida in 1708 who's saying they took 10,000 people. Of course, I doubt they took 10,000 people, but you do have tens of thousands of people enslaved. And I figured, some of them have got to be in Carolina. And indeed, this is a report to the Commissioners of Indian Trade in Carolina. And it indicates that there are enslaved Tocobaga living, probably Santolina Indian is not, there are no Santolina. So I'm assuming what this meant is that around St. Helena in South Carolina. See in this map is the expansion of the Indian slave trade. As populations are just literally dying in droves. The Spanish are reaching further and further afield. And part of this is because of the intricacies of Spanish law that eventually say, well, you can't enslave Indians, they're our subjects. And the Spanish will just say, well, if we go a little further out, they're not our subjects, so we can enslave them, right? Or if they're cannibals, we can enslave them. Or if they're already enslaved by other indigenous people, we can buy those slaves, right? But by the early 1500s, this area is is irreparably changed by these effects. Repeated invasions, almost on a 10-year basis. And the early incentive to visit North America from the Caribbean, if we're talking about the center of Spanish power, the regional center of Spanish power, one of the focuses of these early expeditions that also include Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón and the first by Juan Ponce de León, these are for taking Indian slaves. Whether it is the earliest voyages here, which are sort of reconnaissance missions where they would capture as many as they could and take them back to the Caribbean, or these later voyages. De Soto just goes from town to town taking slaves that included, the headmen and headwomen of these polities. So, adding all of this together, we get a sort of depiction of this Mississippian or Mississippian adjacent world. So here's Calusa, this enormous polity of great geopolitical strength. And when Pedro Menendez arrives in Calusa, he goes to Calusa first. He's on his sort of trip around Florida. And the Calusa king, one of the first comments that he makes to him is that he would like Menendez to ally with him in war against Tocobaga. So it's revealed to us that, there is some deep existing rivalry between these two fairly powerful, one of them fairly powerful and one of them tremendously powerful societies. Now, that's not all of the sort of context that we're dealing with in South Florida, because in addition to this pre-existing interindigenous conflict, so more specifically to the sort of colonial period, when the Adelantado Pedro Menendez visits Tocobaga in 1568, the head cacique at Tocobaga, is able to summon between 29 chiefs and over 100 nobles. So what does that tell us about the potential population at Tocobaga? Well, I don't know. It doesn't tell us a lot. But we could probably estimate that these subordinate chiefs probably represented a village of some size. And so if we estimate that it was between, somewhere between 250 and 500 people, or maybe 1,000 at the very most, probably living there in the capital, we get a rather large population estimate. And the Tocobaga are one of 4 groups that occupy the Tampa Bay area. But it appears from the records that Tocobaga is sort of what we would call the paramount chief. And so this population estimate, given that sort of very loosey-goosey math, historian, not a mathematician, gives us about between 10 and 15,000 people. That is a lot of people. If we consider the sort of Mississippian world that is coming to a decline, by the time Europeans are arriving in the Florida Peninsula, this would probably indicate that this is a complex or paramount chiefdom. Control, tributary responsibility is exercised over a fairly large territory. The center of this is this paramount chief, right? It is a hierarchical society. It is a unilineal society. Most of the Southeast is matrilineal. There is an exception in Calusa, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so historians and archaeologists have found evidence that Tocobagas indeed packed up and moved with the Appalachee, who went and relocated into French Louisiana, and the San Luis de Talimali Indians are still there today, right? And even when the Appalachee flee into French Louisiana, they are noted for their devout Catholicism, right? They want, vestments. They want all the things for their church.
And around the time that they found New Orleans, Louisiana, and the mouth of the Mississippi, Black Indians was already in the area, as you see with a depiction right here. Various Indians living along the Mississippi River. The woman at the lower left is an enslaved fox. She is evidently processing an animal skin. The Negro boy is evidently captured and adopted. So you got an Indian that looked like the other Indians that they're enslaving, but the so-called Negro Indian that's supposed to be the slave is not enslaved. They just captured. Where did they capture them from? Did they capture them from the white people that so-called brought the black people over here, or did they do a morning raid on another tribe and got this black Indian from somewhere, another tribe? Black people was already over here. You got a black Indian right here that's dressed just like the other Indians. Before New Orleans was founded and settled, first they had to discover the mouth of the Mississippi, and this was the man right here, Robert Cavalier de la Salle. He was the man that discovered the mouth of the Mississippi. He went back to French to report, and when he came back to start a settlement, which he thought that he was at the mouth of the Mississippi, he ended up being in Texas to start at Fort St. Louis. And this is the book that we're going to get the game from. As you see, it was copywritten in 1698. So the author of this book is giving it up on how he was living like a millionaire with Robert de la Salle up in Canada, and that they was reading voyages of Juan Ponce de Leon and Pamphilus Narvaez and Christopher Columbus and Fernando de Soto and several other great voyages in order to prepare themselves for the discovery. He also said that Sir de la Salle told him about the unprovoked cruelties and the Spaniards had exercised in Peru and in New Mexico against the people of those great empires, where they had exterminated as far as they could men and women, and had not conferred them the children as to make them a new people. But hold up, they're talking about making new people. So it brought me into the mind of this book right here, 17th Century North America, copywritten 1980. Okay, they say that La Salle had the quality for great enterprise, in particular talent to govern natives. The main motives of his discovery had been to find a port on the Gulf of Mexico for which to go on a conquest of Spanish lands. The river passed very close to New Vescre. Some of the savages along being at war with the Spanish, as were the Pawnees, whom La Salle had seen mounted on horses. He would lead 200 Frenchmen, starting from his Fort St. Louis, with as many as 15,000 warriors, needing only very modest support from French, of soldiers, supplies, and a ship. I say, dang, what the Pawnees doing way in South Texas? I just seen on the map that they was in Florida whenever they was having the Seminole Wars. But I thought that the history say that the Pawnees supposedly come from the Great Plains. And then it had me thinking about what Saatchi said about the Pawnees. And it says that in French Canada, they was Indian slaves. The Pawnees became synonymous with Indian slaves in general use in Canada, and a slave from any tribe came to be a Pawnee. It was at this period, after the middle of the 17th century, that the name was introduced into New Mexico in the form of Panana by bands of mounted Apaches who brought large numbers of Pawnee slaves to trade with the Spaniards and Pueblo Indians. Raiders primarily targeted women and children to be sold as slaves. In 1694, Apaches brought a large number of captive children to the trading fair in New Mexico. But some reason there were not enough buyers, so the Apaches beheaded all the slaves in full view of the Spaniards. Okay, so I say, let me go to the map to see what's the Pawnees on the map, on this map of Louisiana and the Mississippi River by John Senex, that was created and published in 1721. So when I zoom in on the map, I'm looking for the Pawnee, but I ain't seeing no Pawnee. And I can see they already putting the cannibal label on them.
to where they can have the excuse to be able to enslave them and Christianize them. So I just stroll up a little bit on the map, and then I see this in Texas, the Ethiopian wonders. So I know I ain't tripping. I say, let me go to AI real quick just to make sure. And it's telling me regarding the Ethiopian wonders on the map, it's essential to consider the historical context. During the 18th century, Europeans often used terms like Ethiopian or Negro to describe people of African descent, regardless of their actual nationality or ethnicity. So I say, well, let me go back to that French book to see what they was talking about the Indians in the area. It say inhabited by a large number of tribes divided into 40 villages, very abundant in man, who make up a nation of the Croatans, who make war with the Spaniards and who dominate the nations. They saw some of these villages, they are inhabited by good people, but who are nevertheless Berbers. The father asked that the cruelty of the Spaniards make them even more savage. Okay, so I say, damn, they're using another African term to describe the people over here, Berbers, North Africans. LaSalle heard of the Coentinos from the Tios. And plus the narrative was that they was a problem, and that they was a warlike type people, and they was carrying on raids against the Spaniards to the west, and also warring with a tribe called the Senes that was to the east. They was about 150 deep when LaSalle ran up on them, and they was all up on horseback, and he seen them run up on a bull and kill a bull, and they just thought that that was the most amazing thing at the time. Hey, but that's crazy how they on horseback, just like he seen the so-called Pawnees that's supposed to be the so-called slaves. And it's also crazy that this same people is in the same area as the Ethiopian wanderers. And plus they was first mentioned in 1687. And another crazy thing that the tribe Senes, they ended up hooking up with the French and ended up getting at the Croatans from the east. So you got them linked up with the French, and then you got the Spanish coming from the west. Hey, that's what's going on with all the black Aborigine Americans in America. They was getting tag team. Okay, now another group who the Spaniards first encountered in 1581 was a group called the Jumans. Now that's crazy. Another group with a African type name. You got Ethiopians, you got people calling them Berbers. Now you got them calling them Jumans. And now the scholars is arguing that the Jumans disappeared by 1750 due to diseases, slave trade, and warfare. Crazy that this is the same story for all the black originals of America. Another crazy thing is that down there, it's another group called the Cocos. I would say that would be brown people. Why would they call people something that's chocolate? But if we're going to deal with chocolate, Mayans was the ones that was playing with the chocolate. And you already know what the Mayans is, black Aborigines Americans. And there's another nomadic group that was in the area on the Texas coast. Back in 1528, they was the ones that helped out the Spanish explorer Cabas de Vasca. He was the ones that explored from Florida all the way to Mexico. They helped him out, and also in 1685, they had a decline because of disease and warfare with pirates and Anglo-Americans. That was the French that came through and settled. And they said that these people was tall, and they also said that they practiced cannibalism. And by the 1840s, they was completely wiped out. And then we got the Conchos that the Spaniards first conquered and enslaved when they first started opening up the mines in Santa Barbara and Parral. Another funny thing is that the Spaniards were supposed to stop enslaving the so-called Indians in the early 1500s, but we got it in the mid and late 1600s, where still again it's more epidemics of diseases steady wiping out people, and also they are enslaving the Indians, but they saying that they're gonna stop and they're gonna start just enslaving blacks and Indians when they was already had the blacks. But it just seemed like that the Indian population was all good Everything was working good. And then when the French came around and when the Spaniards started exploring more into Texas, because they really wasn't up in Texas until the French came around, that the Indian population declined and all these people in the same area as the Ethiopian wanderers just started disappearing. And then they bring me to this book right here that was copywritten in 1916. And this is telling about a story about Alonzo de Leon was a captain, and he was going through this area and how he was able to get close to the Indians that he didn't know with the Indians that he already had. And this right here is showing that he would give the Indians that was on his team the soldiers' armor and make them dress up like a soldier and have them go over there to talk to the Indians, to make the Indians that didn't never talk to the Spaniards or didn't never talk to white boys be comfortable with dealing with the people that was dressed up like soldiers. But then all they did was backdoor them, bring them in, say they want to be their friend, bring them in and enslave them or just take everything they got. So when I heard that story, it took me to the story of the journey of the Cabas de Vaca, where they basically was using the African that was with them to make it easier for them to communicate and be able to deal with the Indians within the country.
As we proceeded that day, in great fear lest the Indians would follow us, we descried smoke and, going towards it, reached the place after sundown, where we found an Indian who, when he saw us coming, did not wait, but ran away. We sent the Negro after him, and as the Indian saw him approach alone, he waited. The Negro told him that we were going in search of the people that had raised the smoke. He answered that the dwellings were nearby, and that he would guide us, and we followed. He hurried ahead to tell of our coming. At sunset, we came in sight of the lodges, and 2 crossbow shots before reaching them, we met 4 Indians waiting for us, and they received us well. We told them in the language of the Mariames that we had come to see them. They appeared to be pleased with our company and took us to their homes. They lodged Dorantes and the Negro at the house of a medicine man, and me and Castillo at that of another. These Indians speak another language and are called Avavares.
Okay, so when I go back to the original narrative of the early American history, it says the Texas Indians have always had among them an old Indian who was their minister. They observed the customs never to taste any edibles without first taking a portion of it to their minister for sacrifices. They did this with the products of their land, as corn, beans, watermelons, and squash. Hey, but I never known for no Indians to be eating no watermelons like that, and I always thought they always said that the black people always ate watermelons to slaves and that it came from Africa. And when we look back at it, they say that it originated in Africa, but they also say that the Spanish was growing it in the 1576. But in this area that we're talking about in Texas, they wasn't even up that far yet as far as exploring. They went all the way up to Santa Barbara or Parrell, where they have their silver mines. They wasn't going up into Texas until the French got there in the 1680s, and this expedition that they're talking about was in the 1690s. Okay, now the botanical writers are all agreeing that the watermelons originated in Africa, but they also trying to say that they could come from India. Okay, so when I asked AI, do North American Indians eat watermelons? It says yes, but it is important to note that the watermelon is not native to the Americans. It was introduced to them by European settlers. Plus AI saying that it came from Africa. And another fun fact is that in 1597, a Spanish soldier that had went to the same area that DeSoto had traveled to, by the Ocmulgee River in the southeastern part of America, said that the Indians within that area was cultivating and having watermelons. And in 1582, it was reported within the same area in New Spain where the Concho Indians is at, where they just mysteriously disappeared. It was watermelons in their area. I don't know, I just find it very ironic that within the same area you have Ethiopian wanderers, Indians, You also have people calling people Berbers. You got people calling people Julmans. You got a tribe called the Cocos. You got major people getting enslaved and being wiped out by diseases and enslavement and being disappeared and destroyed from the map. And you also got the Pawnee Indians that's supposed to be known as slaves. They in the area. They also in the area of the Seminole Wars when they rounding up the slaves down there, the black slaves. So it's just ironic that all this black stuff is going on down here in South Texas. And when I go back to the French book and I find out what happened to the Cavalier Robert de la Salle down in Fort St. Louis. So he ended up getting killed by his own peoples. They end up chopping off his head, and they end up killing the two people that was with him, his valet and his Indian guide, Nakia. But it's also a story that they killed Nakia and his other partner earlier. He went to go looking for him, and somebody was in the woods waiting for him and shot him in the head, and he died like that. And that he wasn't with Nakia, but that he was with a native Indian that was from the area. But check this out. This is the image that was in the French book. And for the Indian god Nakia, they say that he is an Illinois Indian and that came down with Robert de la Salle through the Mississippi River and was his god the whole time. Hey, but in this picture, this is looking like a black person. And when we look at the picture, he's not dressed like an Indian. He's dressed like the typical black slave that's in America. And so how can I not think that black people was already in America when I take a look at this 1705 map that's showing Florida, Mexico, and the Gulf, which in the south, which we call the third coast, which go from Florida all the way down to Panama, and you seeing terms of black people. Just like on the south coast of Costa Rica, there's an island called Negrita. And then on the north coast of the Yucatan, it was Negrilos. Now, why are those terms in these areas? And if you zoom in on the map, you can see it up and close, what it's called. And today they done changed the name. It's the Scorpio Reefs. But they done took out the Negrilos. Now the islands are called Perez. I guess it's called after someone. Desertora, which means defector. Pajoros, which mean birds. Chica, which mean girl. And Desertora, which mean banished. And as you see, they will change the name throughout history, just like they did in Australia in 2017 with the N word. 10 places named containing the word nigger in Northeast Australia will be renamed due to their racially offensive connotations. References to niggers bounce in northern Queensland were removed from all databases in May. So they taking everything out the databases. And within their database, they had 9 other places that contained the word Mount Nigger, Nigger Head, and 7 spots named Nigger Creek will be discontinued as well. So they can just wipe it out of history like it never happened in the past. And the same thing that they did in New Zealand with 3 areas that had the word containing nigger. All they did was just replace it with words that was taken from the indigenous Maori languages. And plus, the activist Stephen Hagan waged a long campaign to have the ES Nigger Brown stand sign removed from the Toowoomba Sports Ground, which have been redeveloped into Clive Balgrapher Stadium. And the Anti-Defamation Commission Department recognized the deeply offensive derogatory term caused pain to the indigenous Australians and other minorities of African descent. I'm showing that the Maya's ancestors are black. Black people being found in Panama 1513. Cortez guide getting mixed up as a Mayan Indian. You got a Mayan Indian getting stumped out on the horse. You got the first black conquistador saying he fits to go find some black Amazons. You got African so-called settlement in South Carolina. You got a Georgia professor saying that the Tupacs is black maroons. You got black Indians popping up on Mississippi River in Louisiana. You got the Ethiopian wonders in Texas. You got the Pawnees everywhere. Black people getting enslaved. You got black people getting called Berbers in America, and plus they changing the black family history across the world. But stay tuned to Found in America.
In addition to that, historians have also speculated that from the record, it appears that some of them moved closer to the seat of Spanish authority at St. Augustine. However, it's very hard to figure out what happened to them afterwards.